Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The day is over when they can stay in our country and wreak havoc. We are going to get them out, and we're going to get them out fast.
In the first major immigration raids of the Trump presidency, federal agents have arrested more than 600 people, spreading fear in immigrant communities across the country. We'll speak with California State Senate President Kevin De Leon, who's introduced a bill to make California a sanctuary state.
I can tell you half of my family would be eligible for deportation under the executive order.
We'll also speak to Steve Choi, head of the New York Immigration Coalition. But first, hundreds of fast food workers plan to converge today on the corporate offices of Labor Secretary nominee, fast food CEO Andrew Puzder. We'll speak to Saru Jayaraman of the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, or ROC United, and a former employee at one of Puzder's restaurants, Carl's Jr. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Immigration officials have arrested more than 600 people across the U.S. in the last week. The arrests in at least 11 states, including California, New York, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Missouri, and Wisconsin, have spread fear among immigrants and their advocates. It's not clear if ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is continuing routine operations or stepping up its deportations in line with President Trump's policies. On Sunday, Trump tweeted, "The crackdown on illegal criminals is merely the keeping of my campaign promise. Gang members, drug dealers, and others are being removed," he tweeted. The Department of Homeland Security has said the arrests are routine practice. In New York City, ICE says it has arrested more than 40 people over the last week. The raids in the city alone come despite the fact that Mayor Bill de Blasio has insisted New York City is a sanctuary city. On Saturday, hundreds protested the New York Police Department's broken windows policing strategy, under which the police target and arrest people for low-level offenses, funneling people into a process that can result in deportation. Under President Trump's public safety executive order, immigrants face deportation if charged with a crime, even if they're never convicted. This is Albert St. Jean, a Haitian-American fellow with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, addressing Mayor de Blasio at the protest Saturday.
He has to get his house in order if he really wants a sanctuary city, a freedom city. You know, where we can feel free to walk around in our own communities without feeling like, you know, I did something wrong just for existing. Where we don't have to make, like, where little mistakes won't ruin the rest of our lives.
At a march after the protests, police arrested 5 protesters, charging 4 with crossing against a steady red light and 1 with resisting arrest and obstructing governmental administration. One of 170 offenses the New York Police Department cooperates with federal immigration authorities on. We'll have more on the immigration raids nationwide later in the broadcast. Senior White House policy advisor Stephen Miller repeated President Trump's lies about widespread voter fraud in the 2016 election during an interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos on Sunday. He falsely claimed thousands of people were bused to New Hampshire to vote, a claim that's been widely debunked, including by New Hampshire's former Republican Attorney General. Trump's other lies about voter fraud have also been widely debunked. In a separate interview with CBS program Face the Nation, also Sunday, Miller said the White House will fight to reinstate Trump's travel ban and that Trump's authority will not be questioned.
The end result of this, though, is that our opponents, the media, and the whole world will soon see, as we begin to take further actions, that the powers of the president to protect our country are very substantial and will not be questioned.
The suspension of Trump's travel ban was unanimously upheld by a federal appeals court on Thursday. The administration now seems divided on whether and when to appeal the ruling to the Supreme Court. A White House official told media outlets Friday the administration would not immediately challenge the appeals court ruling, but only an hour later, Chief of Staff Reince Priebus said the White House might appeal the ruling. Trump also said he might sign a new executive order to ban immigration condemnation from some majority Muslim countries. Speaking Friday to reporters, Trump said the new executive order might include extreme vetting of immigrants, which many have criticized as being an ideological test. North Korea tested a ballistic missile Sunday, sparking widespread condemnation from South Korea, China, Japan, Russia, the European Union, NATO, and the United States. The test is a violation of a United Nations Security Council resolution. North Korea claimed the test was a successful launch of an intermediate-range missile. The United Nations Security Council says it will hold an urgent consultation Monday in response to the launch. The tests came while Trump was hosting Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe over the weekend at the Trump-owned Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida. The two played golf at the Trump International Golf Club. Ethics groups say the move to host Japan's leader at Trump properties is a clear conflict of interest. Thousands of people rallied nationwide Saturday in support of Planned Parenthood in efforts to counter the planned anti-Planned Parenthood rallies. Opponents of Planned Parenthood said they organized more than 100 rallies in more than 40 states for Saturday. But in multiple cities, when the anti-Planned Parenthood protesters showed up, they were met by even larger crowds of people who support the women's health organization. In Denver, for example, as many as 6,000 pro-Planned Parenthood people rallied, compared to only about 250 to 400 people who rallied to demand the defunding of Planned Parenthood. In Afghanistan, at least 26 people died in the U.S. and NATO-led airstrikes in Helmand province last week. The United Nations majority of the victims were women and children. The deadliest strikes were on Thursday and Friday, when as many as 18 civilians, the majority women and children, were killed. Thousands of Mexicans marched on Mexico City Sunday to denounce President Trump and his plans to deport millions of undocumented immigrants from the United States. This is Mexican writer Hector Aguilar.
I say that he's insane. Mexicans have said no to all that he has done, and we are against the wall and deportations and against all that he is doing to Mexicans over there, like they are enemies. This is how it's perceived here, and there are families who have been very affected. Children don't want to go to school. It's a ghetto-like environment.
In North Dakota, military veterans have begun returning to Standing Rock to support the fight to stop the construction of the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline, which was approved by the Army Corps of Engineers last week. Water protectors say there are an increasing number of helicopters and Bureau of Indian Affairs agents policing the resistance camps. The Guardian reports multiple agents from the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force have been attempting to contact water protectors, sparking concerns the FBI may be investigating the indigenous-led movement as a form of domestic terrorism. Civil rights lawyer Lauren Regan said, quote, "The idea that the government would attempt to construe this indigenous-led nonviolent movement into some kind of domestic terrorism investigation is unfathomable to me. It's outrageous, it's unwarranted, and it's unconstitutional," she said. Water protectors are organizing an Indigenous women's gathering for next weekend, February 18th and 19th, at the Maine Oceti-Sakowin resistance camp. Meanwhile, activists in Bellingham, Washington, shut down Interstate 5 on Saturday as a protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline. In California, more than 180,000 people evacuated their homes after erosion caused damage to the spillway at the nation's tallest dam on Sunday, prompting fears of potential flooding. The Oroville Dam is about 75 miles north of Sacramento. It's already filled after a season of heavy rainfall. On Sunday, officials realized the emergency spillway was eroding, prompting a mandatory evacuation for several counties around the dam. At least 6 New England Patriot players now say they will not visit the White House for the traditional Super Bowl celebration as a protest against President Trump. Defensive end Chris Long, running back LeGarrette Blount, defensive tackle Alan Branch, linebacker Dante Hightower, safety Devin McCowney, and tight end Martellus Bennett are all boycotting the visit. Meanwhile, Seahawk defensive end Michael Bennett and Miami Dolphins wide receiver Kenny Stills have pulled out of an Israeli government-sponsored trip to Israel next week. In an open letter that referenced Muhammad Ali and quoted Olympian John Carlos, Bennett said, quote, "When I go to Israel, and I do plan to go, it will be to see not only Israel, but also the West Bank and Gaza, so I can see how the Palestinians, who've called this land home for thousands of years, live their lives," unquote. President Trump is meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this week in Washington. Trump is also meeting Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau today at the White House. Yale University says it will rename the residential dorm Calhoun College, named after former Vice President John C. Calhoun, one of the most prominent pro-slavery figures in American history. The announcement comes after years of organizing and protests led by students of color. On Saturday, Yale University President Peter Salovey said, quote, "John C. Calhoun's legacy as a white supremacist and a national leader who passionately promoted slavery as a positive good fundamentally conflicts with Yale's mission and values," unquote. Over the summer, Yale University dishwasher Corey Menifee broke a stained glass window at Calhoun College depicting smiling enslaved Africans carrying bales of cotton. This is Corey Menifee speaking about the window and his protests on Democracy Now!
You know, it's a picture. It was a picture that just, you know, as soon as you look at it, it just hurt. You feel it in your heart, like, oh man, like, you know, here in the 21st century, you know, we're in a modern era where we shouldn't have to be subjected to those primitive and degrading images.
The residential dorm, formerly known as Calhoun College, will be renamed for Grace Murray Hopper, a groundbreaking computer scientist and Yale alum. And last night were the 59th Annual Grammy Awards. British singer Adele won a total of 5 awards, including Album of the Year for 25, even though many had expected Beyoncé to win the night's top award for her wildly popular album, Lemonade. Even Adele said Beyoncé should have won the award, and she broke her Grammy in half while on stage. Beyoncé did win 2 awards for Best Music Video and Best Urban Contemporary Album. She was the first of the night to speak about politics in her acceptance speech.
It's important to me to show images to my children that reflect their beauty so they can grow up in a world where they look in the mirror, first through their own families, as well as the news, the Super Bowl, the Olympics, the White House, and the Grammys, and see themselves and have no doubt that they're beautiful, intelligent, and capable.
Other artists also spoke about politics throughout the night, including Michael Jackson's daughter, Paris Jackson, who mentioned the Dakota Access Pipeline protests.
Thank you so much. We can really use this kind of excitement at a pipeline protest, guys. Hashtag no dapple.
Meanwhile, J.Lo quoted a Toni Morrison essay. Actress Laverne Cox spoke about high school student Gavin Grimm's fight for the right to use the bathroom that matches his gender identity, a reference that came only 2 days after the Trump administration said it was dropping a challenge to a federal injunction prohibiting Grimm and other transgender students from having the right to use the bathroom that corresponds to their identity. Katy Perry wore a Planned Parenthood pin and an armband reading "Persist" in reference to Elizabeth Warren's reading of Coretta Scott King's letter against Jeff Sessions during a debate over his confirmation as Attorney General on the Senate floor. Senator Warren was silenced and rebuked for reading the letter. Rapper Busta Rhymes at the Grammys also called out President Trump while making a guest appearance on stage with a tribe called Quest.
I just want to thank President Agent Orange for perpetuating all of the evil that you've been perpetuating throughout the United States. I want to thank President Agent Orange for your unsuccessful attempt at the Muslim ban. When we come together, we the people, we the people, we the people.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Today, hundreds of fast food workers plan to converge on the corporate offices of Labor Secretary nominee Andrew Puzder and demand the fast food mogul withdraw his nomination. Puzder is head of the company that franchises the fast food outlets Hardee's and Carl's Jr. He's a longtime Republican donor who's been a vocal critic of raising the minimum wage, of the Fight for 15 movement, of expansion of overtime pay, and of paid sick leave and the Affordable Care Act. Puzder's Senate confirmation hearing is scheduled for Thursday. The hearing has been postponed 4 times previously. Last week, Puzder became the second of Trump's cabinet nominees to acknowledge hiring an undocumented worker. The first was Commerce Secretary nominee and billionaire Wilbur Ross. Similar practices have led to the rejection of past cabinet nominees, including 2 of President Clinton's nominees for Attorney General in 1993.
The Riverfront Times in St. Louis also reports that Andrew Puzder was accused of abusing his former wife multiple times. Puzder's ex-wife even went on Oprah decades ago in disguise to speak about the domestic violence. Meanwhile, a recent survey by Restaurant Opportunity Center United has found a shocking 2/3 of women working at Puzder's restaurants experience sexual harassment at work. 1/3 of Puzder workers said they've had some of their wages stolen or not received required breaks. The report also called into question the food safety standards at Puzder's restaurants, with nearly 80% of Puzder workers saying they'd prepared or served food while they were sick. Well, for more, we go now to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Saru Jayaraman, who is co-founder and co-director of the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, known as ROC United. Their new report is titled Secretary of Labor Violations, the Low-Road Business Model of CKE Restaurant Inc.'s Andrew Puzder. And in Los Angeles, we're joined by Maggie Guerrero, who worked as a shift leader at a Carl's Jr. for 2 years. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Saru, I believe that the date has now been set for Thursday for Puzder's confirmation hearing. It put off 5 times. It is quite astounding. Can you talk about your concerns about the head of Carl's and Hardee's becoming the Secretary of Labor under Donald Trump?
Absolutely. First, it has to be understood that as the leader of CKE restaurant chains, Andy Puzder is not just a CEO of a fast food company. He's also a leader in the National Restaurant Association, a trade lobby that has essentially lobbied for almost a century to keep wages as low as inhumanely possible, including keeping wages for fast food workers at $7.25 and tipped workers at $2.13 an hour. Today's actually our annual day of action, 213, to highlight the fact that the wage has been stuck at $2.13 an hour for a quarter century. And it's that kind of policy that the National Restaurant Association and Andy Puzder have been lobbying for successfully for the last many, many decades. Now, in his own restaurants, Andy Puzder not only, has said, I wish I could replace these workers with robots. I don't actually believe in the minimum wage at all, but has been found in very serious violation, not only by our report, which was pretty overwhelming, but also by the very department that he is now charged to run. The Department of Labor has found that more than half of his restaurants were in violation of basic wage and hour laws, like not paying overtime, not providing breaks, workers working off the clock, and worst of all, as you mentioned, just incredible amounts of sexual harassment.
Well, Saru, on this issue of his stance on the minimum wage and the fight for 15, here he is, Andy Puzder, on Fox Business News in 2015.
If your concern is to create entry-level jobs for young Americans, then a $15 minimum wage is something you should be protesting against. And this, Dr. Carson brought this up. Labor participation for minority youth is really very low. My friend Art Laffer and I had an article in Investors Business Daily on that about a year and a half ago. But even if you look at labor participation for 16 to 19-year-olds for every race, the reality is that we've hit 4 historic lows this year, and that goes back to when the Bureau of Labor Statistics started recording the data in 1948. So fewer young people are working or looking for work than's been the case since 1948. create. If your objective is to bolster and support the unions, and you're not all that concerned about whether young people will have entry-level jobs, then you should be protesting in favor of a $15 minimum wage. And I think most people are concerned about young people in this country, and fewer people are concerned about big labor.
That was Andy Puzder on Fox Business in 2015. Last year, in an interview with a Business Insider, Labor Secretary nominee Puzder sang the praises of restaurant automation. He said he's quoted as saying that machines are, quote, always polite, they always upsell, they never take a vacation, they never show up late, there's never a slip and fall or an age, sex, or race discrimination case. In other words, robots are completely docile workers as far as he's concerned.
Exploitable. I mean, the fact that, you know, when we did this survey, we did it over the holidays, the busiest time for restaurant workers, and 900 workers from his company reached out to us. It was overwhelming over a 2-week period. 564 filled out these surveys, and 2/3 of a mostly female workforce said they experienced very scary, pretty horrific sexual harassment. You've heard about the ads at Carl's Jr. with nearly naked women. And young women reported in our survey being asked by customers, why aren't you dressed like the women in the ads? I'll take you anyway. And then following them out into the parking lots, grabbing them, touching them, and workers complaining about these things and management doing nothing at all. So yes, if you want a robot who's willing to be touched and not complain about it, you know, I suppose that's the direction you want to go. But clearly, he hasn't done that. He hasn't automated his restaurants. He still has tens of thousands of workers in his restaurants, and they are obviously really suffering, or they wouldn't have reached out to us in the way that they did.
What about this argument that with a lower minimum wage, you have a greater workforce participation rate in the country?
Yeah, what's amazing about that is that our industry right now is actually going through the worst labor shortage in the history of our industry in every major metropolitan area, even as wages are going up. The plurality of his restaurants are in California, where wages are going up to 15, and we are experiencing in California the worst labor shortage in the history of the United States in the restaurant industry. And so, you know, the contrary is true. Jobs continue to grow in this industry at ever increasing rates, even as wages are going up.
Well, we have a number of issues to discuss with you around the Labor Secretary nominee. We'll see if that hearing actually does take place on Thursday. That also go to his personal life, his abuse of his wife, and what this means. Sarah Jayaraman is Restaurant Opportunity Center United. She's with it. And we'll also speak with a worker from one of Carl's Jr.'s places of work that Puzder is CEO of. Stay with us. The Wolf by the Brad, a Chicano punk band from East L.A. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we're looking at Labor Secretary nominee Andrew Puzder, who has his confirmation hearing scheduled for Thursday. Puzder is head of the company that franchises the fast food outlets Hardee's and Carl's Jr. Today, hundreds of fast food workers plan to converge on his corporate offices to demand that he withdraw his nomination.
We're joined by two guests. We've been speaking with Sarah Jairam, who is co-founder and co-director of Restaurant Opportunity Centers United. Their new report, Secretary of Labor Violations, the Low-Road Business Model of CKE Restaurant Inc.'s Andrew Puzder. In Los Angeles, we're joined by Maggie Guerrero, who worked as a shift leader at a Carl's Jr. for 2 years. Maggie, can you talk about your experience there, what your concerns are about Andrew Puzder as Labor Secretary?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you. Well, when I was working at Carl's Jr. in less than a year, I was sexually harassed. I had a coworker approach me and tell me that he wanted to have sexual relations with me, and I asked my manager not to schedule me with him anymore and to do something about it. And she said she would talk to him, but even after that, she still managed to schedule me with him 2 more times. So I brought it up to HR, and they just brushed it off, saying that I came up to them too late. And then on top of that, they promised me a raise for my shift leader pay that I never received. They just keep passing it back and forth to general manager, to the district manager, saying, ask them, ask them. And then I didn't want to quit because I needed to pay for my college education, and I was staying because I needed that. Like right now, I had to drop out of school because I don't have enough to pay for my college.
Well, and in terms of the, how much money did you make when you started there? What were your hours like? What kind of benefits did you have, if any?
I didn't have any benefits. I was always just making the minimum wage. I started off at $9, which was the minimum wage at the time, and then $10.50, which was minimum wage when I stopped working there.
Well, the Washington Post reports Puzder's chains of restaurants, Carl's Jr. and Hardee's, have been the subject of multiple Labor Department investigations over wage theft, which have led the companies to pay nearly $150,000 in back pay to workers and more than $80,000 in penalties. The companies have also been cited with more than 30 health and safety violations. What were some of the problematic conditions that you had at your place of work?
Well, I was sexually harassed. I had the wage theft as well. I never got my raise for the shift leader position that I had, as many other people were also sexually harassed and did get wage theft as well.
Well, last month, workers at Carl's Jr., like you, Maggie, and also Hardee's, the 2 fast food chains run by Puzder, spoke about widespread wage theft and abuse at his restaurants during a forum that was hosted by Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren and Washington Senator Patty Murray. This is Laura McDonald, a former general manager at Carl's Jr.
My name's Laura McDonald, and I'm talking to you today because I worked for Carl Karcher Enterprises for more than 20 years. I actually worked in California. I moved to Tucson recently with my new job. I want to tell you what it's like to work for Mr. Puzder. Everything at CKE is controlled from the top. There are thousands of pages of manuals that control everything. There's also strict standards. Every restaurant has to meet the strict standards for wait time, service time for your drive-through, time, and a long list of other standards. Meeting all those standards is a huge amount of work. CKE requires all of its general managers to be available 24/7. They specifically tell you that you must always be available by phone and to address problems in the restaurant and to answer calls from the district manager. The work is nonstop. I worked more than 60 hours a week there. Until 2009, CKE paid a flat salary to general managers. Even though we do the exact same work as hourly employees, the company refused to pay any overtime or even to pay anything to recognize the fact that we always work more than 40 hours each week.
So, Sarah Jairam, if you can weigh in on this hearing that took place, where it took place, did senators hear it who are going to be deciding the fate of Andrew Puzder, whether he'll become the Labor Secretary?
Absolutely, yes. It was put on by Senator Murray and Senator Warren, as you mentioned. Senator Merkley participated. Senator Warren and Senator Murray will be part of the hearing. Senator Warren, as you know, has put out a number of questions today, actually, to Puzder in a 28-page letter calling on his qualifications to run the department when he, per our report, really should be indicted by the very department that he's being charged to run. One of our members actually spoke at that hearing Roberto and from LA, who worked at the company for 18 years, and at the end of an 18-year career at Carl's Jr., had his paycheck stolen by his manager. His manager literally just signed over his paycheck to herself. He inquired about it, and after inquiring about it, was essentially terminated after a few weeks. So that's the kind of treatment that this company has given to workers who've worked in the company for a very, very long time. The hearing was packed. The testimony has been heard by millions of people online. It's an incredible story, incredible stories that are getting out there. It's amazing that this man is still being considered to run the very department that, as I mentioned, really should be indicting his company.
And I wanted to ask you about his other activities. He's not only a businessman, as you say, a leader of the Restaurant Association, but he's also very active in other conservative Republican issues. Are you aware or knowledgeable about some of those?
Yes, I mean, he's been very ideological on issues of choice and, all kinds of issues pertaining to women. He's actually supported mostly Republican, but some Democrats as well on these issues. And through the National Restaurant Association has spent millions of dollars to prevent the minimum wage from going up and other worker protections, has fought against health care reform, against policies like paid sick days. So this is a man who, paid like $700,000 towards the Trump campaign, a very ideological Republican capitalist that really, you have to understand, with Andy Puzder going into the head of the Department of Labor, that's essentially giving this trade lobby that has been lobbying really since slavery times to keep wages as low as possible, if not, or not have them at all. You're essentially giving the National Restaurant Association a seat in the cabinet and the complete control over the very department that is supposed to be looking out for the welfare of workers.
During an appearance on Fox News' Fox and Friends in 2015, Andy Puzder claimed many workers don't want higher wages because they're afraid of losing government benefits. This is Puzder speaking to Steve Doocy on Fox.
The policy guys call it the welfare cliff, because you get to a point where if you make a few more dollars, you actually lose thousands of dollars in benefits. Right. And quite honestly, these benefits are essential for some people. They're how they pay the rent. They're how they feed their kids. Sure. So what happens is we have people who turn down promotions, or if minimum wage goes up, they want fewer hours, they want less hours because they're afraid they'll go over that cliff. Sure. And you really make the distance between dependence and independence too broad to gap.
And it's got to drive you nuts because you're always looking for good people to run your stores. And if they would just take the next step, take the next step up the ladder, next thing you know, they could be a manager making $80,000, but they don't want to lose the free stuff from the government.
Yeah, it really locks people into poverty. It's a system that does, it just is, it was well intended to help people who need relief, but it really locks them into poverty, and we need a different system.
So that is Andrew Puzder on Fox and Friends with Steve Doocy. Sarah Jayaraman, your response.
The amazing thing about these comments is that they are essentially admitting that they, as not just CKE, but as an industry, are relying on taxpayer dollars for the survival of their workers. The kinds of benefits they're talking about are food stamps, Medicaid, all kinds of public assistance that these workers rely on because their wages are absurdly low. And the real solution is not to find a way to allow these workers to continue to rely on these taxpayer-funded benefits, but to pay them enough that they can actually survive without benefits, which is what most of these workers want. In fact, the taxpayer pays $16.5 billion on taxpayer-funded benefits just for this one industry alone. And so it's important to realize that the National Restaurant Association argues both to keep the minimum wage as low as possible and argues against raising the minimum wage because these workers need benefits, which they are essentially relying on to subsidize their workers' wages and survival. It's an unsustainable business model, and the real solution is to raise the wage to the point where the workers don't have to rely on benefits at all.
Well, it's unsustainable for everyone but the corporate executives, right? Because Puzder made about $4.4 million in 2012.
In some years, it's estimated he's made as much as $10 million. If you look at the reimbursements he's received for his own medical expenses, they're pretty extraordinary. They're larger than some workers' wages in a whole year, just for his medical reimbursements. So It's incredibly hypocritical.
Let me ask you about this new controversy that's come out. Andy Puzder facing increasing criticism over his admission that he hired an undocumented housekeeper. Puzder says he and his wife employed an undocumented housekeeper for a number of years, then fired her after learning she didn't have U.S. work documents in the midst of, him being considered for Secretary of Labor is when he fired her. He also says they provided her help in obtaining U.S. documentation. Puzder is the second of Trump's cabinet nominees who's acknowledged hiring an undocumented worker. The first was Commerce Secretary nominee billionaire Wilbur Ross. Similar practices have led to the rejection of past cabinet nominees, like two of President Clinton's nominees for Attorney General, Zoe Baird and Kimba Wood in 1993. Saru, your response for his hiring of the undocumented housekeeper and what happened next in this issue across whoever does this?
I think the key question is if this man didn't know that his domestic worker was undocumented, then why didn't he pay taxes for her employment from the first place? Why did he, when he said he learned about her status, then go say he went back and paid back taxes? The truth is that this man employs millions of undocumented workers. The industry employs millions of undocumented workers. The industry relies on immigrants, both undocumented and documented. The National Restaurant Association has said many, many times that the industry would collapse without these workers. The real question is, under what conditions do these workers survive and work in this country? The administration, in the same breath as bringing on this man, who has now said he definitely had an undocumented domestic worker and has many more in his company, in the same breath is, saying that they're going to get rid of millions of undocumented workers. When you put the National Restaurant Association, which has said so many times that its industry would collapse without these workers, in charge of a cabinet position, you know that they don't really actually want to get rid of these workers. They want to create a climate of fear in which workers, like robots, won't speak up, won't complain about anything at all. That's really what's going on here. It's a bit of a schizophrenic kind of policy in which you have one man in charge of workers who has hired undocumented workers and says he prefers robots. And on the other hand, the administration is going out, engaging in raids, talking about immigration enforcement, when in fact we all know that these CEOs absolutely depend on these workers, not just as domestic workers, but in their companies to do the work to make the millions that they want to make.
And the accusation against Puzder of domestic abuse by his ex-wife, who even went on Oprah in disguise to speak about his domestic violence in a 1988 petition. The ex-wife, Lisa Firestein, said Puzder had, quote, assaulted and battered her by striking her violently about the face, chest, back, shoulders, and neck without provocation or cause, and that as a consequence she suffered severe and permanent injuries. His ex-wife would later withdraw the allegations as part of a 1990 child custody agreement. But how does this fit in?
I won't comment to what happened to his wife since she withdrew her charges. I will say it's important to keep that in mind as you look at the ads. You've seen these ads of Carl's Jr. restaurants in which they have nearly naked women holding up burgers in front of their breasts, or lying on the floor eating a burger, or feeding burgers to each other in naked positions. And then you look at the data from our report and other reports showing that young women, often very young women, 16, 17, 18-year-old girls, were harassed, grabbed, assaulted in various ways. As I said, told by customers, why aren't you dressed like the girls in the ads? Clearly, this is a man who doesn't respect women at all, is fine with women being degraded in his ads, and has said, well, ugly women don't sell burgers, and then is also fine with young women being assaulted in his restaurants when they're trying to do their job. I mean, 2/3 of women in our survey said that they had been sexually harassed in various ways. That's 1.5 times the rate of the rest of the industry, which already, by the way, has 5 times the rate of sexual harassment of the entire rest of the economy. So you're talking about the worst sexual violator of any company in an industry that's already the worst sexual harasser of any industry. And this is the man who's in charge of the welfare of women workers in our country. horrific.
And finally, Saru, while we have you on as an organizer of the restaurant, as an organizer of ROC, I wanted to ask you about these raids across the country, over 600 people. In a moment, we're going to speak to the Senate president in California. The effect on working people and Carl's and Hardee's all over the country and beyond, of course, what this has meant.
Yeah, this industry, as I said, is the largest employer of undocumented workers, of immigrants, of all different kinds of Muslim immigrants. And what we are seeing is that these raids, these actions are really meant to strike fear in the heart of workers, to keep them from speaking up, to keep them from doing anything that would expose themselves or make themselves a target. And what we need to do as a nation, as an industry, is stand up. Many of our employers have come forward and formed something called sanctuary restaurants, not saying that they're going to harbor undocumented immigrants, but really saying they're going to stand by their workers of all identities. And we as workers just need to continue to resist because we can't allow them to think that we're going to roll over and be afraid when they engage in these kinds of actions, which is precisely their point. So actually on March 8th, International Women's Day, we are calling for a national action on the Department of Labor. We will be gathering in front of the Department of Labor with thousands of women workers from across the country.
Saru, we want to thank you for being with us. Saru Jayaraman of Restaurant Opportunity Centers United. And we want to thank Maggie Guerrero, the former Carl's Jr. employee, for joining us from California. When we come back, we're going to California, to Sacramento, the state capital, to talk with the Senate president, to talk with Kevin De Leon about his proposal for a sanctuary state and what is happening with these raids. Many of the raids in this past week taking place in California. Stay with us.
Now how you feel? CEOs getting mega paid while you barely making minimum wage. The first time I put that pen to a page, when I realized I couldn't be the government slave. I got the same attitude from back in the day. Now I got bigger bills, bigger problems to deal with, but I'm still sick. Lance Armstrong, being broke is a position that ain't that comfy. What's on the menu? Bread and lunch meat, and I ain't even getting paid till next week. It's getting cold, so it's time to invest in heat. The streets cold, so I had to invest in heat. They sleep on technique, so I bless these beats. And I ain't even gotta explain how stressed I be. Man, life ain't perfect, but it's all worth it. So systematic, be part of that circuit. Robotic at work when I'm counting them pyramids. If you're naive, then I know you ain't hearing this. Hundreds of years, everybody been fearing this greedy ass system that's coming to an end. I got bills galore, I need my bread up. Am I the only person?
Fight for It by A.D. Arsonisto, Brittany, and LV. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, immigrant communities across the country are on edge after federal immigration agents arrested over 600 people in the past week in the largest raid since Donald Trump became president. Raids were reported in at least 11 states, including California, New York, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Missouri, and Wisconsin. It is not clear if ICE or Immigration and Customs Enforcement is continuing routine operations or stepping up its deportations in line with President Trump's policies. On Sunday, Trump tweeted, quote, "The crackdown on illegal criminals is merely the keeping of my campaign promise. Gang members, drug dealers, and others are being removed." But Department of Homeland Security has said the arrests were long planned and routine.
Immigrant rights activists say the actions signal a clear shift by the Trump administration to deport people who are considered a low priority for removal under President Obama. An executive order issued during the first week of Trump's presidency expanded the group of immigrants considered priorities for deportation, including those without criminal records, as well as those accused of crimes but not convicted. President of the California State Senate, Kevin De Leon, who will be joining us in a minute, spoke out against the raids.
I can tell you half of my family would be eligible for deportation under the executive order, because if they got a false Social Security card, if they got a false identification, if they got a false driver's license prior to us passing AB 60, if they got a false green card, and anyone who has family members, you know, who are undocumented knows that almost entirely everybody has secured some sort of false identification. That's what you need to survive, to work.
To talk more about the arrest, we go to Sacramento, where we're joined by California State Senate President Kevin DeLeon. We're also joined by Stephen Choi here in New York, Executive Director of the New York Immigration Coalition. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Senator DeLeon, talk about what you were describing in this clip, so that when President Trump says we're deporting criminals, what it means to have a criminal record when you're undocumented.
Well, good morning, Amy. And that was a testimony during a Senate public safety hearing in Sacramento, the state capitol, with regards to my measure, the California Values Act. The reality is this, is that the vast majority of very hardworking, law-abiding, taxpayer residents of California and of the nation who are currently undocumented, many of them do possess in some form identification that they probably secured to get access to employment. This is quite common, and you wouldn't be able to do so, say, for example, work at Carl's Jr. If you're undocumented without securing some type of identification. The reality is this, is that there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of panic, and the levels of anxiety are extremely high, especially among children, the American-born children of these law-abiding, tax-paying residents of California, because of the most recent raids that have taken place during the past week. When President Trump campaigned on deporting the most violent, those who are criminal felons, he made it very clear just recently through his executive order that he's going to actually broaden the eligibility, the criteria for deportation. And the reality is this: we have innocent mothers, we have innocent fathers, hardworking individuals who will be rounded up because of the broadening of the criteria. And they're making, or they will be making, children fatherless as well as motherless, separating children from their mothers and mothers from their children. So what I'm trying to do with my colleagues in California is to make sure that the federal government does not commandeer our local police agencies, our state police agencies, and use our tax dollars to be an extension of the Trump deportation machine.
Well, you were mentioning families separated. We reported last week on the case of Guadalupe Garcia de Rayos in Phoenix, Arizona. The felony conviction that they referred to in her case was the only crime was that she had been rounded up several years ago in a raid by Sheriff Joe Arpaio and convicted on a felony count of having false identification, and that was the basis by which then suddenly now she's been deported with her 2 U.S.-born children and her husband here still in the United States. So this is obviously a growing problem. If you expand the definition of the dangerous felony folks that are subject to deportation to include, as you say, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have had to resort to false identification in order to be able to work, which is why they came here in the first place, isn't it?
That is correct, Juan. Again, President Trump campaigned on the promise that he would actually deport very dangerous criminal felons. But the reality is this: with the executive orders and with Chris Kobach, Stephen Miller, as well as Steve Bannon, they have their sights set on hardworking residents of California and other parts of the country, New York, Florida, Texas, and elsewhere. The case in Arizona, the case of this young woman, Guadalupe, who is married, who's been a resident of Arizona for a very long time, since childhood, who has 2 American-born children, teenagers, I believe, routinely checked in with ICE authorities. And then all of a sudden, the tone, tenor, the attitude of ICE changed quite dramatically after the January 20th inauguration of President Donald Trump. She clearly is not a gang member. She's clearly not a violent offender. She's clearly not a rapist or a thug or a murderer. But nonetheless, ICE detained her. She submitted herself to check in with them on a voluntary basis and now has been deported. This is not who we are as a nation, and this is not who we are as a state like California. We don't separate children from their mothers and mothers from their children. It's un-American, and these are not the values that we uphold as the greatest nation in the entire world. It is my deep concern that he is planting the seeds of fear, of mistrust, of anxiety, of chaos. But I'm especially concerned about young children. because you have young children, boys and girls, who are deeply fearful that at the curbside, when they're waiting for their mothers or their fathers, will they actually show up to pick them up? Or have they been detained by ICE agents because they have a broken taillight or they have an expired driver's license? These are not criminals. These are individuals who make up the fabric of who we are as the greatest nation in the greatest state in the world.
Steve Cho, I'd like to ask you in terms of what's happening here in New York, and also, is there really a substantial difference between what's going on now in the first weeks of the Trump administration and what was occurring under the Obama administration?
Well, there's a little bit of a difference here. I mean, the fact is, under the Obama administration, you saw hundreds of thousands of people being deported. And I think that's a problem that we need to really understand in terms of context. Millions, hundreds of thousands of people every single year. In fact, the Obama administration at one point in 1 year deported nearly 400,000 people. So this kind of activity has been occurring. The problem, though, with ICE saying that these are simply routine operations is that we are in a moment that is anything but routine. We have a president who, as candidate, ran the single most anti-immigrant campaign in the history of the United States. And it's a president who, in his very first week of his presidency, declared war on immigrant communities. He has said that he is going to ramp up enforcement activity and deportations. He's going to triple the ICE force. He's going to expand greatly the number of kinds of offenses that people can commit. And we're really talking about potentially 25 million people in this country who potentially could be deported according to his executive order. So the idea that ICE turns around and says, look, these are just routine operations, we should not be in fear, people should not be engaging in hysteria, there's a little bit of blaming the victim going on. It's their actions in this moment and in this time of the administration that is causing this kind of fear.
So I want to talk about sanctuary cities and states. Kevin DeLeon, you have introduced a bill to make California a sanctuary state. Last week, Fox News' Bill O'Reilly asked Trump about your bill.
Well, I think it's ridiculous, sanctuary cities. As you know, I'm very much opposed to sanctuary cities. They breed crime. There's a lot of problems. If we have to, we'll defund. We give tremendous amounts of money to California.
So you're going to defund.
California, in many ways, is out of control, as you know. Obviously, the voters agree. Otherwise, they wouldn't have voted for me.
So defunding is your weapon of choice.
Well, it's a weapon. I don't want to defund a state or a city. I don't want to defund anybody. I want to give them the money they need to properly operate as a city or a state. If they're going to have sanctuary cities, we may have to do that. Certainly, that would be a weapon.
So, Senate President Pro Tem Kevin DeLeon, your response, the defunding of the state of California, and what exactly a sanctuary state means?
Well, a couple things, Amy. Far from being out of control, we are the 6th largest economy, not nationally, but in the entire world. We're an incredible tapestry of different ethnicities and hues and immigrants from all over the nation, from all over the world. But let me underscore something. I'm going to make up a word because I think he's weaponizing federal funding. When the president makes the threats that he has made as of recent, that he's going to withhold dollars from California. What he's doing is he's threatening senior citizens who have the early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's, or children who are on the spectrum of Asperger's or autism. He is threatening to punish and to hurt people. That's mean-spirited, that's vindictiveness, that is spitefulness. That's not who we are as a nation. And just as importantly, it's illegal. It's unconstitutional. This is not a monarchy. This is a republic. The president, by fiat, cannot threaten a state like California to withhold dollars. And let me be very clear about something. Those dollars belong to the people of California. They are our tax dollars by hardworking Californians. They're not Donald Trump's dollars. He's not giving it to us out of the largest of his heart because it's a gift to California. Those are the constituents of the hard-working taxpayers of California. So, what I'm attempting to do is to make sure that we're not a cog in the deportation machine of Donald Trump. That in order for Donald Trump to be successful in separating children from mothers and mothers from children, he needs to commandeer local police departments. He needs to commandeer local sheriffs. He needs to commandeer state highway patrol to be an extension of the federal immigration authorities. I want to make sure that he doesn't use our tax dollars, our hard-earned tax dollars, to separate children from their mothers by commandeering our local police agencies as well as resources. I'm clearly aware that federal immigration law is the sole exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government and Homeland Security and ICE. But if you think that the state of California is going to cooperate with you, be very clear about one thing. We're not going to lift one single finger, nor are we going to spend one single cent to help this man separate children from their mothers. It's just not who we are as a state. It's not who we are as a great country.
And Steve Choi, New York City obviously is in the same situation, declaring itself, Mayor de Blasio has declared New York City a sanctuary city. Your sense of the threats of cutoffs of funds to municipalities, especially in lieu of the fact of how much money New York City provides the rest of the nation in its taxes?
Yeah. I mean, there is a threat, but I think I want to start by saying the term sanctuary is a little bit misleading. Really, when we are talking about sanctuary, we're talking about two things. One is a confidentiality policy that says that when city and state employees are talking to people, they're not asking about immigration status. And we're also talking about detainer policies that basically say if people are caught up in the criminal justice system and ICE issues a detainer, those don't have to be respected. Those are common sense policies that make our cities and our states safer. There was a mayor of New York City who believed so strongly in these policies that he filed a lawsuit that went all the way up to the Supreme Court and said, if you're undocumented and you're hardworking, we don't want you to feel like you're a fugitive. We want you here in this city. That was Rudy Giuliani back in 1997. So if it's good enough for Rudy Giuliani in 1997, it should be good enough for Donald Trump in 2017. I do want to note, though, that sanctuary is a little bit misleading. I think the issue is that we do need to make sure that in California and New York, cities and states are not doing anything to actually make deportations happen. But there's nothing that stops ICE, as we saw this past weekend, there's nothing that stops ICE from coming to New York City, doing raids, engaging in kinds of actions that are going to sweep people up. And so I think we need to make sure that when people use the term sanctuary, they're not providing a misleading sense of hope that ICE can't come into these cities and states, because they can.
Kevin De Leon, how do you protect people in Los Angeles and San Francisco, throughout California, in Sacramento, around this issue that, of course, ICE is there, they're raiding people? Do you think, in fact, Los Angeles was targeted for being a sanctuary city? People are talking about that in Austin. Activists are saying in Texas, you have the governor who has cut off funds to Austin because it's a sanctuary city and says he wants to put a ban on any kind of sanctuary legislation.
A couple things, Amy, as well as Juan, is I do agree with Steve. The terminology sanctuary city, sanctuary state is a bit misleading, because it gives you the perception that you have an invisible force shield. And as long as you get behind that invisible force shield, you are safe. That's not the reality. Federal immigration law is exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government, Homeland Security, and ICE. If you are undocumented, you can be detained, and you can eventually be deported, hopefully after due process. But the reality is this: it's very difficult to know if Homeland Security and ICE stepped up their efforts because of Donald Trump, because of the lack of transparency and accountability. Now, during President Barack Obama's administration, there was more collaboration, more cooperation. The reason why is they didn't want to instill fear and panic among immigrant communities throughout Southern California and elsewhere. That's not the case with this new administration. It was very difficult to secure the necessary information to know exactly who they were going after and who they were not going after. That breeds mistrust. A couple of things I want to highlight, too, is when Donald Trump said that sanctuary cities breeds more crime. That can be farther from the truth. In fact, we have empirical evidence, real data, that clearly states that sanctuary cities, or so-called quote-unquote sanctuary cities, they have actually less crime than non-sanctuary cities. And let me go back to the governor of the state of Texas and his punishment of a great city like Austin, Texas. This shows you how different states are dealing with the issue of immigration, or the lack thereof immigration reform. And this is a very clear reflection of the abdication of responsibility, political and legal responsibility of the Congress to deal with this issue, combined border security as well as a pathway to legal residency and citizenship.
I want to end with Stephen Choi just asking, if ICE comes to your door, do you have to open it?
You don't have to open it. If they ask you questions, you don't have to answer them. You can request a lawyer. I mean, these are some of the basic rights.
They have to show you a warrant. They have to slip that through the door, and they most usually don't have one.
I think what we've found is often that ICE thinks that they are going to a certain place, and what they'll call them collateral targets. That's their term, about people who may not necessarily be the target who get swept up. I mean, the fact is we do need to educate folks because they have rights that are guaranteed, and we need to make sure everybody knows about them.
I want to thank you, Stephen Choi, for joining us with the New York Immigration Coalition, and thank you to Kevin DeLeon, President Pro Tem of the California State Senate. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now!, produced by Mike Burke. Very happy birthday to Brendan Allen. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.